Hello, welcome to Mastering Java. Here in this lesson number 3, we're going to really learn about a lot of things here. So I'm going to warn you up front that you might have to watch this lesson a couple of times to really understand everything that we're talking about. Nothing in here is hard, but I'm going to introduce a lot of new concepts that kind of need to be discussed in order for you to really understand what I'm talking about. So let's revisit what we've done recently. We've learned how to read a single character from the keyboard using system.in.read. And we were able to use that in many different ways, and it's really great. But the problem with that is it's really only intended to read one byte at a time from the keyboard, which is one character at a time. So it's great if you're trying to answer yes or no questions, but what if you're trying to read a number, like a big number, like 347? I mean, you can see the number 347 is, or 345, let's say, is 3 characters. So I would have to do a system.in.read for the 3, and then another system.in.read for the 4, and then another one for the 5, and then I'd have to put all those things together and form it into an actual number to represent the number 345. So reading single characters from the keyboard to represent numbers is not really easy to do. Also, what if you wanted to do 345.25? How do you represent the decimal? I know you can read the period in from the keyboard, but how do you represent it as the number 345.25 when you're reading each character at a time from the keyboard? So it's possible to do by reading one character at a time, but it's very cumbersome. So what I want to do is show you how to read integers in from the keyboard. If you want to read the number 1004, you'd be able to do that. And I also want to show you how to read characters from the keyboard or numbers from the keyboard that are doubles, which are decimals. So 65.325. The reason I want to teach you how to read things in from the keyboard early on in this course is because it makes programming much more fun. If I can write a program that reads in your age and then tells you something about it or calculates something, that's a lot more fun than just having these programs where I'm declaring variables and doing things with them. So what you're seeing in this lesson here typically is not taught until much later in a Java programming book. I want you to know how to read keyboard input because I think it makes the course more rich and more fun as you learn programming. All right, so having said that, I need to tell you that system.in.read, which we've done before, is only used really to read one character at a time. Lots of limitations. So how do we read integers, which are numbers, and how do we read decimals, double precision numbers, as we've discussed before? To do that, we're going to use something called the scanner class. Now, I know that a lot of you probably have heard of the term class before in terms of object-oriented programming language. We haven't discussed what a class is really much at all. We've done a little bit of discussion, but not very much. And we certainly are not going to discuss real object-oriented stuff until later in the course. But the scanner method that we're going to use here, the scanner class that we're going to use here to read stuff from the keyboard, it is a class. So I have to show you at least a little bit of object-oriented stuff so that you'll understand and have at least some idea of what we're talking about. So in order to actually use the scanner class to read from the keyboard, before your class definition here, you need to type in import java.util.S. You see it's trying to tell me here, scanner, so I'll do scanner. And then you just put a semicolon at the end. All of the red disappears. Notice we have a little bit of a squiggly. If you highlight over it or hover over it, it says the import of Java util scanner is never used. Basically, in Java 5, which was quite some time ago, they provided the Java class called scanner. And that consists of lots of different methods and utilities used to read keyboard input that are much, much easier to use than system.in.read, reading one byte at a time. Much easier to use. It's very powerful. All right, but because Java's object-oriented, the scanner class is got some overhead to it I need to explain for you to understand. So the first thing we need to talk about before you do much of anything else is just do a little bit of a quick review of what a class is, okay? In Java or C++ or any of these other object-oriented programming languages, you need to understand what the concept of a class is. A class is a template. Say that to yourself. A class is a template. A class is a template. If I were going to make a template for a car, right, then I might want to specify that a car might have wheels, it might have tires, it might have a radio, So I might want to define a bunch of features that I think a car has. A car might have a top speed, etc. So if I were going to define a class called car, I might provision in there to define what the wheels might look like, what the tires might look like, what type of radio it has, what kind of top speed it has, and so on. But I'm not really defining a specific car, I'm defining a class called car, because all cars have wheels, and all cars have tires, and all cars have radios, well, almost all of them, and all cars have some kind of top speed that I can define. So instead of, when I'm writing my program, defining every single car over and over and over again, I might just define this template called car that has all these attributes that are common to all cars. Now then, if I want to actually use one of these cars in my program, maybe I'm writing a racing game or something and I've got 10 different cars, so I've got the template defined, so then I might want to create an actual instance of one of these cars. So what we say is we create one of these objects called of the car class. So that's what you hear, object-oriented programming. It's all about creating an object from a class, which is a template that you've defined. So instead of just defining car, right, I might then in that case define Honda, right? That's, you know, a very specific type. Or maybe I want to say it's a Honda Accord. That's a very specific type of car, but we know the size of the wheels and we know the top speed and we know everything about the Honda Accord. So then I can make a copy of the car class, which contains all of the attributes, and I just assign values to them or whatever I'm trying to do to define the details of the Honda Accord. Maybe I have a Honda Civic. Maybe I have, you know, a Honda, well, let's do Toyota minivan. Right? So you see, they're all, even though this is a minivan, they're all sharing attributes with the general thing that we call car class. We know that they have top speed, we know they have tires, we know they have all these things. So we can then define an instance of one of these cars, and we'll call it a Honda Accord. We can define an instance of one of these cars. We'll call it a Honda Civic. We can define an instance of one of these things. We'll call it a Toyota minivan. So another way of saying it, instead of calling it an instance, you can say you're creating an object. We're calling it a Toyota minivan. We create an object called Honda Civic. This is all terminology. And so you're basically creating objects from the class, which is a template that's already been created for you, or when you get more proficient in programming, you can create your own classes. So let me put that aside for a second and tell you that the creators of Java have created a very powerful class called the scanner class. This line at the top of the program just imports that into our file here so that we can use that scanner class. All right, so the first thing we want to do is create an instance of that scanner class so we can use it to read from the keyboard. Another way of saying that is we want to create an object from the scanner class so that we can then use it. And the way you do that in Java in terms of creating a scanner class, let me just type it all out and we'll talk about it. You type scanner, right? And you have to give it a name. Just like when you're doing an integer, you have to give the integer a name, right? So in scanner, we'll just call it keyboard input. Notice I have the K lowercase and the next word uppercase. That's pretty typical in Java. So this is kind of creating, if I just left a semicolon there, that would be kind of creating the basic idea of what we're trying to do of creating an object. But what we want to do is we want to create a new scanner object. Oops. And we'll put a semicolon there. And on the inside of the parentheses, what we need is system.in. All right, I'm done typing. All the red text goes away. This thing right here, every single time you use a scanner in order to read stuff from the keyboard, you need to have this line in the beginning of your main method. You'll also need this line up here. All right, so what it's doing is this is not just something that scanner uses. This is the way that you declare, and I should say that you create objects from classes in Java. So what you have is, this is the scanner class. This is the name of the object that you are creating. So this is the general class. This, in our previous example, would be Honda Accord. We would be calling it Honda Accord, or we'd be calling Honda Civic. Here we're calling it keyboard input because it's a specific object of what I'm creating that I'm going to use. So I'm creating that thing, but I've got to assign something to it. So I'm creating a new scanner object, right? And this scanner object is reading stuff in from the default system.in, which is the keyboard. Some of this stuff can get a little confusing on the right-hand side because we haven't talked about constructors and other things in object-oriented programming language. But basically, whenever you create an object, the thing comes into existence with a constructor. So what happens is we're creating a new scanner object, and we're telling the system to read stuff in from the default system.in. You know how we did system.out before when we do something like system.out.println? Well, the system.out is telling Java we're printing to the screen, right? System.in is telling it that it's coming in from the keyboard. It's the default input method. So just kind of get used to seeing this. This, you can kind of think of it, you know, how we do things like integer, age, and length. Maybe we create some variables called age and length. Well, this is the type of variable, and this is the name. You can kind of think of this as the type of object, or in this case it's the class, and this is its name, and then so we create that and we have to set it equal to something, but in this case we're creating the new object, so the new keyword creates the new object of scanner type, and everything's coming from the keyboard. Alright, I know that could be a little bit confusing. You need to get kind of used to seeing that because we're going to use it here every time we read from the keyboard. We're also going to use it later on when we do real object-oriented programming, which we haven't gotten to yet. I could just tell you, hey, type this in, but I'm trying to tell you what it is so that you understand it. Okay, so this creates our object called keyboard input to read stuff from the input from the keyboard using the scanner class that's provided in this guy up here. All right, so now we want to finally do something. So let's go ahead and put something to the screen, system.out.println. So let's read an integer in. That's the easiest thing to do. Enter any integer like this. So we'll do an integer there, and what we want to do, let's create an integer called test. We'll just call it test. So we've created an integer called test. We print something out to the screen, says enter any integer. Now we have to ask for the keyboard input to actually come in. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the scanner object that we've created called keyboard input to do that. Now, we've talked about the class. We've talked about creating a new instance of that class. This is the name of it. All right. Now, the other thing you need to realize when you create objects like this is they're going to have methods associated with them. When you create a class, you define methods that make sense for the class. In this case, we need some methods to read stuff from the keyboard. So the main method that we're going to use here is keyboard dot, or I should say input. This is the scanner object we've created, dot, and then we will say next int, like that. When you type this in, keyboard input, this is the scanner object that we have. The dot says we're using a method from that class. Next int is one of the methods of the scanner class. So when we've created this object here, then the next int method is automatically available to be used. So this means next int means we're reading the next integer. So what we want to do finally is say test, which is our variable, is equal to that. So make sure you understand what's happening here. We print out enter any integer, right? And then we're saying that our variable up here, which is an integer, is equal to reading in from the keyboard the next available integer that's there. All right? So then let's go skip down here and say system.out.println, and we'll say you entered the number, and we'll do it like this with a plus test. Because we've already read it in, we've already stored the value in the variable called test, now we're just printing it out to the screen. So let's see what happens. We'll print this guy here, enter any integer. So we'll enter the integer of 5, and we'll hit enter. You entered the number 5. The program is over now. Notice how control is back. It's blinking, but there's not really waiting for anything. We can do it again. 925. You entered the number 925. Integers are positive or negative quantities, so we can say negative 98. You entered the number negative 98. So every time we run through the program, we basically are going to be reading in from the keyboard with this line here, the integer that's available to be read, and then we're going to be storing that into the variable called test. And then we can use this variable anywhere through our program, just as we've done any other variable or any other integer that we have. So from this point on, I can use test in for loops, in if statements. I can use them to calculate things. For instance, I could come down here and say, let's do another one here. let's create a new integer called number. So number is equal to test times 10. Let's change this to number. So what we're doing now is we're reading in and we're multiplying the number times 10. We're storing it into a new variable and we're printing out the new variable. So now when I enter 45, I should multiply by 10 and I should have the number 450. All right. So notice that in this case, when I read the keyboard input, I'm reading next integer. I'm reading the next integer available at the keyboard. And I can go and read something else again. So let me go ahead and change this here. Let me take this out. And let me change this back to the number test. And let me take this out because I certainly don't need that anymore. So basically we're back to where we started. Right now after I read this in, I can go and say, in fact I can just copy this whole thing. I can hit Control C for copy and I can come down here and paste it in. So I can say enter another integer. Let me go ahead and skip a line down here, \n, right? And then I can, again, read the next integer from the keyboard, store it into the variable, and then I could say you entered the number test. So let me go and hit this guy, enter an integer 5. When I print it out, it says you entered the number 5, enter another integer. It's waiting for input again. I can hit the number 8, you entered the number 8. Now the program is done. When I try to hit the keyboard, there's nothing else going on anymore. But notice that in each of these cases, I'm using the method called nextInt because I'm expecting to read an integer in there. All right, I'm expecting to read an integer in there. Let me show you what happens. Let me take off this second read here. Just delete that. Let me show you what happens if you put something in that's not an integer. All right, so let me run that. It's waiting for an integer, 4.5, right? So it's waiting for an integer. It's reading in with the nextInt method here, but I haven't actually input an integer. I put a floating point number in there. So I hit the enter key. Notice what happens. There's a bunch of exceptions. You've got an exception in this thread. You've got some stuff with Java Util Scanner. There's a throw here, a bunch of really weird stuff, but you know that there's a big error. In fact, it says input mismatch exception. That's a big clue for you. Anytime you see an exception, it's telling you error. There's an error of some kind. And what happened is I lied in it. Basically, I'm using the method to read an integer, but I actually didn't give it an integer. That's a big problem. I'm going to show you how to fix that in a minute to catch that sort of error, but I wanted just to show you real quickly what it does. So that kind of begs the question, then how do we read decimals? How do we read double numbers, which are floating point numbers with a decimal point? Well, let me show you how we do that. All right. So let's change this. So we'll do, this is an integer number. Let me just do this. We'll change this, change the variable names, integer number, and then this guy will be integer number. So everything is basically exactly the same. I can enter 8 and I get 8 back. Okay? I'm just changing it because now I want to create a double called double number, which is a decimal number. Okay? And I want to show you how to read that in. So let me skip down a little bit here and show you how to do that. So then what we're going to do is do system.out.println like this. And then I'll have a quotation in the center. Let me skip down 2 lines and I'll say enter any decimal number. Double. Like that. All right? And then I need to read the keyboard input. So then I'm going to say, I'm going to store it into the variable called double number equals. I'm going to do the same thing again. I have a scanner object that we've called keyboard input. That's what I'm using to read all my keyboard. So I'm going to say keyboard input. But I don't want to read an integer. I want to read the next double. So that is a method in the scanner class. To read doubles, you use the method next double. And to read integers, you use the method next integer like that. So I've read it in there. And then I want to do system.out.println like this. You entered the double number, or I should say decimal just to make it clear. Decimal number, blah, blah, blah. And then over here, you just put double number because that's the number I'm storing in. So let's just see if that works. We'll hit this guy, enter any integer. So we'll hit 7. I entered the number 7. Enter any decimal number. So we'll do 4.5. Notice this time you entered the decimal number 4.5. All right. So the bottom line is when you know that you're reading integers, you need to use the scanner that you have created, dot, next int with the two parentheses, this is a method, which is like a little subroutine that it's calling, and it's reading the next integer in from the keyboard there, and then you can use it as needed. In this case, we're storing it into a variable, and then we use it as appropriate. Then when the next text says enter your double, we're not using next int. That's for reading integers. We're using the method called next double, which is also a method of the scanner class that's available to read decimals. So that's the most common times you're going to read keyboard inputs. When you're reading integers, I'm going to recommend that you use the scanner class, create your scanner instance there, and then read integers in like this, read doubles in like this. Now let me show you one more thing. Actually, let me put that back, undo typing. Let me show you one more thing that's pretty important, that's very useful. Okay, we said before, we can run this again. Right here, we're expecting an integer, right? Actually, let me just go ahead and start over here. We're expecting an integer. We put the 7 in. Here, we're expecting a decimal. We put a decimal in. But we've already said that bad things happen if we do what's not expected in the program. If I put a decimal in here, we get this error, basically, that kicks us out. All right? So let's take what we've done here off, like this. And let's fix that. So the read actually happens right here. What we want to do is only do this read if we know that there's an integer waiting at the keyboard. Then we do the read, right? So the way you handle that typically is you put an if statement there. And the if is going to be as follows. Integer, it's going to be keyboard input. This is our scanner class that we have. There's another method called has next integer. Notice that the N is capitalized and the I is capitalized, but the H is not. Notice it's trying to tell me that it's Boolean, which means it returns true or false. So this is a method. If it returns true, then we do it. Make sure you understand what's happening. So we print the guy, it says enter an integer. Then it says if keyboard input, the method called has next int is called. If there is an integer there, then it's going to return true, and if that happens, then I do the keyboard input, assign the value to the variable. If this returns false, then nothing happens. So let me hit save and go ahead and do this guy. And you can see I have an error here, so let's go back and look and see what it's complaining about. We have a red underline here. When you hover over it, it says the local variable integer number may not have been initialized. Anytime you see something that hasn't been initialized, then just assign the variable a value of 0. We can delete this for the time being. Assign a value of 0 just because what's going on here is we are using the variable here, but it's inside of an if statement. This is a single line if statement. So Java doesn't really know if it's ever been initialized, so let's go ahead and initialize it for it. We'll go ahead and hit run here. Enter any integer. If we actually enter an integer properly, then this if statement will evaluate to true and we'll read it in. So it behaves exactly as we expect. However, if we now come down and hit 4.5, which is wrong, then the program just terminates. Basically, it doesn't terminate. What happens is this if does not evaluate correctly, right? It evaluates to false. So we never read anything from the keyboard. We already have a value of 0 stored in this variable, so then we just fall through. We bounce over this if effectively, and the program stops. So this if statement here, right before your scanner input, is very common. I suggest that you get in the habit of doing that. As we showed before, you don't really have to do it. If you're confident that you're typing in integers, then all you really need is this. If you're confident you're typing in decimal numbers and you're using next double, then you can, of course, use that. But if you want some sort of error trapping to prevent, problems, then you really need to use this if statement here, there. So I'm going to put a comment up here just to kind of show you the important methods here. The important methods here is inside of the scanner class is next integer. This one reads the next integer from the keyboard, right? The next one that we've talked about is next double. This reads the next floating point number from the keyboard, right? And then next one that's very important is has next integer. This one returns true or false depending on if there's an integer there or not. We're just using that one here. There's also a complement for this one called has next double. And that checks to see if there's a decimal number there. So we can change this guy around to show you that right here. Let's just go ahead and change this guy. We'll change this to be a double. We'll change this guy to be a double, right? Just to change the names a little bit. Enter any decimal number. All right. If keyboard input dot has next double, that's what we're trying to do, double equals true, then double number is going to be equal to the keyboard input, but not next int. We need to be reading the next double. All right, and then we'll print it out. You entered the number, and then we need to, of course, use the variable that we have defined here, double number. Let's make sure this works. So we'll go ahead and hit this guy. If we put 4.5 in, then we get out what we expect to put in. So what we expected, because we typed in a number there, a decimal point there. So make sure you understand that there's a lot of stuff in this section that is kind of hitting you hard and heavy, and I understand that. And I wrestled for a long time with how to approach this. A lot of books don't even show you how to read anything from the keyboard until way later, because they try to teach you all about objects and classes and a lot of overhead just to be able to do something, in my opinion, pretty simple to read something from a keyboard. The bottom line is when you're reading from a keyboard, you need to remember these three things. The first thing is you need to import javautil.util.scanner. That's going to give us access to the scanner class, which has already been created for you. Then the first thing you want to do inside of your main method is create an object of type scanner. Right? This is just like creating something of type integer or something of type float. It's an analogy. It's not quite the same, but it's very similar. So we put the scanner keyboard in there. So that's telling Java, hey, we want to create something of type scanner. We want to name it this, and what we're going to do is associate with that a new scanner object. In this case, we're reading in from the keyboard, so this needs to be there as well. So now that we have this scanner object defined, and this is the name of the keyboard input, we can access all of the methods of the scanner class that's already been created for you. So in this case, the way you access those methods is you put the name of what you've created, dot. The dot says, hey, I'm going to access a method that of the type that I have in this class. In this case, has next double is going to be a method that just looks at the keyboard and says, is there a double there or not? If there is, then true. Return true. If not, return false. So we're checking to see if there's a double at the keyboard. If it's true, then we'll read that keyboard input with the method called next double, and we'll assign that to this variable that we've created. So this is really all you need. I mean, you could eliminate this if you really wanted to. As you saw in the beginning, all you really need is this to read the keyboard input, and then you can do whatever you want with it. This is just trying to catch errors. So in most of my examples, you'll probably see that I have this there. Just keep in mind that this is doing the real reading in of what we have. Once we have this keyboard input read as a double into a double variable, we can do anything we want. Here we're printing it to the screen. We can multiply, divide it. We can do whatever we want. We can put it in if statements and so on there. So make sure you understand this, and then go off into the examples or I should say the exercises, and try to do them yourself, because you really need a little bit of practice with learning how to use the scanner class. It's not hard to do. Really, you just have to put this line in. You need to create your scanner object there, and then after that you just use it to read the keyboard input, and you can really create rich Java programs to really enhance your learning when you can create a program that reads from the keyboard and then do things with that input. You're going to learn a lot more than if you're just writing these static programs that are just declaring variables over and over and over again. So make sure you understand this, do the exercises, make sure you understand how the exercises behave, and then follow me on to the next lesson where we will continue learning Java.